Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you like this episode, please remember to hit the like button and leave a comment or two, then subscribe and click on the bell to receive notifications of whenever we release new videos. Also, please remember to share them to your social media. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the agricultural fields surrounding Cody, Wyoming. When you think of grizzly bear attacks, a cornfield isn't the first background that comes to mind. But this area isn't just farm fields. The Shoshone National Forest surrounds it and is only about 30 miles east of Yellowstone National Park. The land between the park and the farmland is remote and rugged mountains with uninterrupted forests of pine, fir, and spruce trees along the ridges. The Shoshone National Forest is on the eastern slope of the Great Divide, and all the waters that fill the creeks head toward the Mississippi River. Down in the valleys, willows and berry bushes screen the creek banks for the animals that live there. Moose, mule deer, elk, and antelope are common sights here. Black bears, bobcats, cougars, grizzly bears, and wolves stalk the trails while they raise the next generation of predators. Although the ridges and hillsides may be as wild as they've ever been, the agricultural areas in the valleys are dotted with ranches and farms. The water that feeds the creeks and streams is often diverted to water the corn, wheat, and alfalfa that grows here. It may be too remote for most people, but the hardy people of western Wyoming wouldn't live anywhere else. This lifestyle demands hard work, which shapes and conditions the people who work the land. On Thursday, June 20th, 2013, 65-year-old Nick Patrick had beaten the sun out of bed and was headed toward his fields. The creek beds around Nick's fields were crowded with brush and smaller trees that hid pheasants, grouse, and deer. They were all common sights in the early morning hours and were always a pleasant surprise for Nick. Nick was a big supporter of the protection of grizzly bears in Wyoming. He served on the Greater Yellowstone Coalition Board, which strives to preserve vital habitats, create travel corridors for wildlife, and connect human allies to support these resources. Nick had even hosted board meetings at his ranch in recent years. This week, Nick had a handful of special visitors to his ranch. His oldest daughter had brought her 4 children to visit Grandpa on the ranch, but Nick didn't let that pull him away from his work. He would complete the day's work, then visit with them afterward, catching up on all the fun events that had transpired in their lives. As Nick worked his way along the ditch bank, his dog began to bark incessantly a short distance away. Raccoons were common in the area, and Nick assumed the dog had run into another one. He picked up his shovel and headed toward the gully, located about 50 yards from where he was working in the field. Just as Nick began to walk down into the gully, he could see his dog. It was barking toward the brush along the creek, but what he was barking at wasn't very clear. Before Nick could gain control of the dog, a huge sow grizzly stormed from the brush, followed closely by her 2 cubs. Grizzly bears are not an uncommon sight around Cody, especially on the hills above Nick's fields. They can be seen grazing their way across green meadows from the roads in springtime. Once in a while, a problem will arise with a bear killing livestock or raiding grain supplies, but generally they keep to themselves. They tend to avoid anything affiliated with humans as much as possible. Once the sow set her eyes on Nick, there wasn't much taking her attention away from him. She quickly covered the ground between them at a rate that didn't afford Nick any time to think, let alone react. He could see her massive shoulder muscles ripple with each stride as she streaked toward him. It was clear by her immense size that Nick could not fight her, and he knew good and well there was no sense in trying to outrun her. Nick had only one weapon at his side, his trusty shovel. He picked it up like a baseball bat and did his best impression of Babe Ruth upside the grizzly's head. As the shovel smacked against the sow's skull, Nick soon realized the noise it made was the worst part. The grizzly wasn't bothered by the blow from the shovel and didn't slow down in her progress toward him. Given he had put all of his energy into swinging the shovel, Nick was briefly left in a twisted posture. Both of his arms were holding the shovel, which was now to his left and behind him. This pose left his face pointed toward the bear, with nothing to protect it. The angry sow used the awkward position Nick's shovel swing had left him in and clamped her jaws around his entire face. Her canines sank in from cheekbone to cheekbone, and when she closed her jaws, she peeled off the skin between them, including Nick's nose. The cracking and popping of his cheekbones drowned out all the other noise Nick could hear. The sow pulled the mouthful of Nick's face away while pressing his shoulders with her paws. As the sow loosened her grip on Nick's face, she slid her jaws down his body to his left knee. Clamping her jaws onto it, she dragged him about 20 feet, puncturing and tearing flesh as she did so. Now missing most of the middle part of his face and fearing the sow was going to continue her attack, Nick flipped onto his stomach. Playing dead must have seemed like the best option, as resistance was clearly futile. He was hoping that he could cover up any vulnerable parts of himself that she hadn't yet bit into, but for some reason the sow suddenly changed her mind. It may have been thoughts of her cubs, or perhaps she felt Nick was no longer a danger. Either way, the sow disappeared into the brush as Nick lay on his stomach. As he lifted his head from the soil, Nick could feel his upper lip flopping against his chin. He knew this grizzly had done some terrifying damage to his face, so he reached into his pocket in search of his cell phone. He pulled the phone out and quickly dialed 911, hoping to find a calming professional on the other end. Unfortunately for Nick, the gully he was in was without reception, and no one answered his call for help. Upon seeing him moving, the grizzly sow bounded back in Nick's direction. She must have figured he was dead when she left, and was a bit angered to see he wasn't. This time she bit onto the back of his head and chewed up his scalp real good. Like the unwilling participant in some kind of sadistic game, Nick jerked and screamed each time the sow bit into a different area than she had previously. The pressure from her jaws was the most overwhelming sensation. Nick had never felt such pain before in his life, and felt the bear's canines piercing his flesh and slamming against his bones, with crunches that resonated through his body. Her claws and teeth punched quick holes and gashes through Nick's vest and back before she dashed back into the brush. As soon as she left him, Nick peeked up the gully to see her gather her cubs and leave. He continued to watch the bears as they disappeared from sight, hoping that she would not return for a third round. Nick pulled himself together and began assessing his wounds, at least those that he could see. His most devastating injury was clearly out of his view, but he could feel the middle part of his face was missing. It may have been the adrenaline, but Nick knew he had to get to medical help as quickly as possible. There was no one walking along that gully any time soon, in all likelihood, and Nick couldn't afford to wait for help. He slowly worked his way to his feet and staggered toward his home, which was a few hundred yards away. After reaching his home, he stumbled his way back to his shop. Nick knew his grandkids would run outside to see him as soon as he arrived, and he knew that the damage the sow had inflicted on his face would terrify them. He immediately stumbled into his workshop in search of a towel, trailing blood behind him. Wiping the blood and other bodily fluids from his face, Nick eventually found the towel he was looking for and draped it over his head. Then he staggered toward the house to ask them to call for medical help. When first responders arrived, they loaded Nick into the ambulance and rushed him toward West Park Hospital in Cody. As soon as he arrived, the medical staff there recognized that his wounds were far too severe for treatment from their facility. They arranged for a medical helicopter to transport Nick to the University of Colorado Hospital in Aurora, Colorado. He was stabilized there and remained in the intensive care unit while a ventilator helped him breathe. The middle of Nick's face, including his nose and all the skin between his cheekbones, had completely been removed. The risk of infection was immediately identified, given the injuries to his sinuses only a few inches from his brain. Wyoming Game and Fish officers began an investigation into the cause and circumstances of Nick's grizzly bear attack. They set out culvert traps along the gullies and fields in the area, hoping to catch the bears before any further incidents could occur. If they caught the sow, they could check her for a lip tattoo or an ear tag to gauge whether she had been a problem bear or if this was simply an isolated incident. They were not considering euthanizing the sow without knowing her background, if there was one at all. The wardens found the sow's tracks and followed them away from the agricultural areas in the valley. The bears had departed for more remote areas away from people. Given she would not likely encounter any more people in the location she had ended up at, they decided to stop tracking her, for now. Wardens decided the grizzly sow had reacted to a perceived threat to herself and her cubs. As severe as it was, the attack was deemed a defensive attack. Nick's dog ended up with a long gash down his back, but recovered from his run-in with the grizzly. Nick's efforts had likely saved his dog's life, but nearly cost him his own. As Nick slowly recovered in the ICU, his friends sent prayers and messages of support. They noted that being in good physical condition probably contributed to him surviving the severe mauling. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. Would the sow have left after the initial attack if he had played dead? Did the presence of the dog add an aggravating circumstance for the grizzly? Do you think this sow should be pursued and killed after such a brutal mauling? I will gladly read and respond to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks.
Today's episode takes us to Granite Creek, which flows just northwest of Mount Eielson in Denali National Park, Alaska. The creek bed is thick with alder and willow bushes, limiting visibility to a very short distance. In the valley bottoms, the land is flat but quickly slopes upward, with each peak in the area rising over 5,000 feet in elevation. The jagged peaks here are alpine, which leaves them barren of trees. Dull sheep somehow eke out a living in this cold and bleak environment. In the plants along the creeks, moose, caribou, and marmot seek shelter from the elements. Hiding from wolverines, wolves, lynx, black bears, and brown bears isn't an easy task, but somehow they manage. In Denali National Park, roads provide access to trailheads which lead to panoramic views that few human feet had trod. This area is in nearly the same condition as it had been for thousands of years. Many of the animals here seldom, if ever, see human beings, let alone feel a substantial impact from their presence. Hiroshi Tokura was a 25-year-old man on August 11, 1980. He and 3 of his friends were hiking through the park, taking breathtaking photos and otherwise enjoying each other's company in the beauty of the park. As the hikers approached the edge of Granite Creek, the bushes grew thick and tall. The babbling of the creek plays its own peaceful tune as occasional breezes wave through the treetops. The hikers were immersed in the scents, sounds, and sights of Mother Nature's art gallery. Hiroshi was leading the hiking group as they navigated the trail through the brush. As he pushed the willow limbs out of his way, he heard a strange sound only a few yards in front of him. The sound reminded him of a large dog's bark, but resonated in deeper, longer tones. Hiroshi knew that moose and caribou didn't make this sound, but was worried that he might find out what animal does. As soon as he glanced around a willow bush, an enormous brown bear came into view. The bear had already been alerted to the hikers' presence, as evidenced by its woof in their direction. They didn't know enough about bears to heed its warning, though, and really couldn't have done much about it, given their proximity to the bear. From about 6 yards away from Hiroshi, the brown bear's low build and massive musculature easily pushed its way through the brush in an eruption that panicked the hikers. Behind the bear, he could see the brush parting as another animal was fleeing. Hiroshi began yelling at the bear and took steps backward to put distance between himself and the bear. He knew that the paltry steps he was taking away from the bear were being quickly outpaced by the bear's leaps. This is where the record gets a little confusing. Sometimes when people experience a traumatic experience, they do things they do not remember later. One of the hikers states that Hiroshi turned and ran away from the bear, but he only remembers squatting down and placing his arms over his head to protect himself from the bear's claws and jaws. Given that Hiroshi was the closest of the hikers to the bear, he bore the brunt of its anger. In fact, he bore all the brunt. The brown bear was upon him before he could react. Every part of the man's body that was touched by the bear's claws was torn and gashed. Its claws acted like the blades of a giant blender against the man's skin. As Hiroshi's flesh was being ripped apart, the bear bit into his shoulder. It drove its teeth deep into the muscle and tissue surrounding his bones, causing deep cavity wounds and punctures. The bear didn't stop there, though. It switched its attack to biting his back as he crumpled to the ground under the weight of the bear's body. The gashes torn by the bear's huge canine teeth easily ripped through the skin of his back, and pain seared through his body. Hiroshi couldn't help but scream out in pain as his hiking companions looked on as their friend was tattered before their eyes. With Hiroshi flattened out on the ground, the brown bear turned its jaws toward his rear end. It clamped its teeth onto his buttocks and ripped open puncture wounds. Hiroshi was clearly no threat to this bear, but what it did next would make you think it considered him a potent enemy. As he lay on his stomach, the bear turned its jaws toward his head. It wasn't satisfied with injuring the man, as it had clearly done that. It took his head in its jaws and bit down as hard as it could. Its bottom canines ripped into the flesh as the base of his skull, while its top canines tore into the flesh along his hairline. As it closed its jaws, it tore his scalp back and away from his skull. Hiroshi was clearly incapacitated by every means, but this brown bear wasn't satisfied with that. It had to make sure this man would not endanger it ever again. As a final measure to end this very one-sided struggle, the bear opened its jaws wide. It clamped its canines across Hiroshi's face from cheekbone to cheekbone and bit down. His bones cracked and gave way under the bite pressure of the bear's jaws. Crushing his face was the last impartation of violence the bear completed on the man's body. After having his face crushed, Hiroshi lay still. It isn't indicated whether he was unconscious or playing dead, but at any rate the bear had decided he was no longer a danger to it. As it stood over Hiroshi's mangled body, it huffed and panted from the exertion. It stared at him, apparently waiting for any sign of life. As soon as it was satisfied that he was dead, the brown bear slowly walked back toward the direction it had come from and disappeared into the brush. Hiroshi's friends had fled into the bushes nearby. After his cries for help ceased, and they heard the bear leaving, they slowly emerged from their hiding places. They called to each other as they focused their efforts on saving Hiroshi's life. The hikers somehow got Hiroshi out to a location that allowed rescuers to reach him. He was transported to the hospital for life-saving surgery. He would undergo many operations to restructure his facial bones, close his numerous wounds, and clean his gashes. There is no record I could find that indicated the precise number of sutures or stitches the medical teams used to close his wounds, but with injuries like Hiroshi's, they would have to number in the hundreds. His treatment must have continued well past the point that his wounds healed. The reconstruction of his facial bones alone would require several operations and possibly necessitate bones from other parts of his body being transplanted into his face to aid in healing there. Searching the internet proved very difficult to find any further information on how Hiroshi fared following this attack. There isn't any information on what happened with the bears either. It is almost like any information about this attack has been expunged from the internet for some reason. Hiroshi's attack was utilized to help shape policy surrounding bear treatment and avoidance by authorities. In the Denali National Park Bear-Human Conflict Management Plan, more than a few pages were written based on information garnered from attacks like Hiroshi's. Given that the second animal he saw fled through the brush as the bear approached him, Hiroshi indicated that he thought there were 2 brown bears there when he was attacked. If his insights are accurate, then that animal was likely a cub of the bear that attacked him. An attack from a sow bear is usually labeled a defensive attack, and most of the time no action is taken against the bear. Given the bear didn't remain in the area, cover Hiroshi with duff, or guard his body, it was clearly not a predatory attack. As far as the evidence showed, it had not stalked the group and ambushed them. That excluded a predatory attack as well. That leaves the potential that the attack was exclusively defensive in nature. But it also begs the question of why was Hiroshi's attack so devastating? The bear had incapacitated him immediately, and he was not resisting or fighting with the bear. It seems to me that the injuries he suffered were egregious but unnecessary given his behavior. Analyzing the injuries imparted by the bear, note that there were none listed on Hiroshi's hands and arms, even though he used them to cover his head. This indicates that he wasn't reaching his arms toward the bear to ward its jaws away from him. If he had done that, the bear would have mangled his hands and arms in its attack. The fact that he squatted down seems to indicate that he wasn't sure if he should run or play dead. If he had curled into a ball on the ground instead of squatting, do you think it would have led to different injuries on his body? After reviewing the details of this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. Do you think the other animal Hiroshi saw feeling the area was a cub? Did the potential presence of the cubs exacerbate the aggression of this attack? Would bear spray have changed the outcome of this attack? Could Hiroshi or his fellow hikers have utilized a firearm in a competent manner to defend him? What could the hikers have done differently to avoid such a close encounter with an angry brown bear? I will be glad to read and respond to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below and let's talk about it.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks.
Today's episode takes us to Denali National Park headquarters. The geography in the parks features the world's highest mountain in relief. When assessing a mountain's relief, it is measured from the elevation at which it starts and all the way to the top. Denali Mountain, also known as Mount McKinley, measures 20,310 feet, with the world's highest mountain, Mount Everest, reaching 29,302 feet, but only about 15,000 feet in relief. Relief is the measurement of a mountain's height from its base to its peak, but the elevation is the maximum height of a mountain without regard to its base. The area surrounding Denali was formed into a national park and was established on February 26, 1917, as Mountain McKinley National Park. The headquarters of the park is located within the first mile of the George Parks Highway entrance and offers visitors restaurants, hotels, and gift shops. The mountains of this area are covered with alder and willow, but in the valleys, spruce, fir, and birch trees dominate the skyline.
Moose, caribou, and sheep roam the trails while they hide from black bears, wolves, and grizzly bears. In the early morning hours of June 4th, 1980, 21-year-old Dan Marin and two of his co-workers were making their way across the parking lot. They were employees of one of the hotels that housed visitors to the park and were used to the beauty and dangers the park presented. As the hotel workers walked along the road, they watched two huge moose trotting toward them. These moose were not moseying like normal. They had a sense of urgency in their steps and were continually looking over their own back trail as if something was following them. Now, brown bears are not known to hunt in packs or tolerate each other's presence for extended periods of time. They are usually known to hunt and exist in solitude, except when the salmon run. During this time, the riverbanks are crowded by giant bears, pacified by bellies full of salmon roe and skin. They tolerate each other during this time due to an abundance of food, and this is not the typical condition for their existence. As the workers watched the nervous moose galloping across the road, they noticed that two huge grizzlies emerged from the same location on the roadside from which the moose had come. One of the bears was larger than the other, but they were clearly both grown and mature. Dan and his co-workers knew that the presence of the bears presented a substantial risk to their safety. Most of the time, grizzlies around the park would have little to do with humans, especially when there was more than one person in the group. The tension in the air was high, but the people did expect the bears to offer very little more than a passing interest in them as they loped across the road. Dan and the others stopped walking as soon as they had seen the bears following the moose. They knew that drawing the bears' attention could create a precarious situation, so they froze in their tracks. To their horror, the larger grizzly craned his neck toward the small crowd of people and immediately veered his loping stride toward them. The bears were only about 100 yards away when they initially emerged from the roadside brush, but the larger one quickly closed that distance. The workers grew increasingly nervous as the bear focused its eyes on them while it bounced effortlessly toward them. They undoubtedly hoped the bear would peel off and return to chasing the moose after investigating what they were. But the bear wasn't planning on chasing the moose anymore once it determined that there was easier prey nearby. Like a covey of quail exploding from brush, the hotel workers scattered in panic once the bear got within 20 yards. Dan ran toward the trees while the other two ran in other directions. He reached up and pulled himself into the tree, hoping to get high enough to discourage the grizzly from pursuing him any further. At this time, most people believed that grizzly bears could not effectively climb trees, and seeking shelter there was the best strategy. For the most part, grizzlies do not invest their energy in pursuing people who climb trees. But if the tree has low limbs that allow the bears to climb up, sort of what people would need to climb a tree, then they can climb up and pursue people. As Dan hurriedly pulled himself higher into the tree, the grizzly quickly approached the base of the tree. Now, the average grown grizzly bear stands at around 7 feet tall on its hind legs and can reach another couple of feet higher after extending its front paws. This means that anyone trying to escape a grizzly must get the lowest portion of their body at least 10 feet into the tree to avoid its reach. Dan almost got there, but not quite. As soon as the bear reached the base of Dan's tree, it stood to its hind legs and stretched its powerful jaws toward his lagging left foot. In another second or so, Dan would have been able to pull his foot out of reach of the bear, but before he could do that, the bear latched onto his ankle. The pressure exerted by the bear's jaws drove its huge canines into the bones of Dan's ankle, causing excruciating pain. Once the bear had clamped onto Dan's ankle, it used its mass to prevent him from climbing any higher into the tree. A bizarre tug of war broke out momentarily as Dan fought for his life. This struggle didn't last very long, as the bear used its weight to overwhelm Dan's grip on the tree trunk. In one powerful jerk on his ankle, the bear sent Dan plummeting back to the base of the tree. As soon as he hit the ground, Dan knew he had to protect himself or escape. This bear had run right up to his small group, then pursued him into the tree and even pulled him from its heights. It was clearly not going to be satisfied with pulling him from the tree. Dan scrambled to his feet and was filled with terror, being only a few feet from the massive bear. For an unknown reason, the brown bear ran a short distance away and glanced around. It almost seemed like the bear was trying to find the other people who had fled its jaws. Perhaps it was looking for the moose it was previously pursuing. Either way, Dan wasn't waiting around to find out which option the bear was most interested in. He immediately began to pull himself back up into the same tree. It was only a few seconds between Dan's abrupt landing to the point that he climbed back into the tree. It was possible that the bear considered him as food and was searching for another victim as it glanced around. After looking for anyone else around him, the bear turned his attention back toward Dan. This time, the man had climbed as fast as he could to get away from the bear. He knew better than to wait for the bear any longer, and had to get himself higher into the tree, even if it meant the bear would climb up to get him. As soon as the bear redirected its attention to Dan, it returned to the base of the tree. Again, it stood to its hind legs and reached its jaws toward Dan's ankle. It also placed its paws against the tree, trying to reach him one more time. This time, Dan had managed to get just out of range of the bear's jaws and claws just before it could bite him again. He watched as the bear was just a few inches from reaching him. It repeatedly tried to get its jaws onto his foot again and tried to pull itself higher into the tree. After trying for a short time, the bear reluctantly gave up on his pursuit of Dan and redirected its predatory urges back to the moose. After he was sure the bears had left, Dan and the other hotel workers yelled to locate one another. They nervously emerged from their hiding places and regrouped to return to the hotel. Dan had suffered puncture wounds in his left ankle from the giant bear's canines. As it tugged him from the tree, the pressure of the bear's jaws had bruised and stretched his tissues around the wounds it inflicted. He was taken to the nearby medical center, and his wounds were cleaned and bandaged. Dan was able to make a complete recovery from the injuries inflicted during the bear attack. There was no source I could find indicating that the grizzlies were pursued or killed by authorities. The attack happened so quickly, and the bears immediately fled the area in pursuit of the moose. No further action was reportedly taken against the bears. After reviewing the facts surrounding this attack, I have a few questions for you. Even though the bear didn't actually climb the tree, do you think climbing a tree is a safe way to escape a grizzly bear attack? Why didn't the bear kill or maul Dan worse than it did? Do you think the two grizzly bears were cooperating while they pursued the moose? Would the scenario of massive grizzly bears forming hunting packs keep you awake at night? I will gladly read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to Grande Prairie, Alberta, Canada. This area is covered with broad oat fields, ringed by enormous rolling forests of quaking aspen, European mountain ash, poplar, and elder trees. Beneath this emerald canopy, bushes like serviceberry, raspberry, chokecherry, and dogwood display their beautiful flowers and offer sugary treats to birds and animals alike. Along the ground, stunning arrays of wild sunflowers and ox-eye daisies dance in the prairie breezes. The elevation of this land undulates in the lower 2,000-foot range, and seasons are dramatic, with hot, dry summers and cold, snowy winters. Game animals here are plentiful and diverse. Moose, elk, pronghorned antelope, bison, as well as white-tailed deer and mule deer meander along the edges of fields. The predators in this area include bobcats, coyotes, and wolves. With this abundance of game and berry options for food, black bears and brown bears are thriving. On August 12, 2007, 32-year-old Chris McClellan relocated to Grande Prairie from Prospero, Nova Scotia with his wife and son. The newlywed landed a job as a welder and was an avid outdoorsman. One of his favorite activities was bow hunting, and Grande Prairie was a great spot to do it. On August 15, 2007, Chris decided to go out scouting for archery season by himself. He decked himself out in full-body camouflage, including a face mask, so that animals might not see him as he scouted. McClellan drove onto Range Road 73 to a farmer's oat field, about 12 kilometers south of the small town of Grovedale, blissfully unaware of just how much excitement and danger this day had in store for him. The archery hunter spent a few hours glassing the fence rows and assessing his odds of success. He began to work his way back toward his vehicle about 9:30 p.m. Chris hadn't packed bear spray, nor was he carrying a firearm on his trip. His only form of self-defense was a hunting knife, with a 12-inch long blade and a digital camera. Just before dusk, Chris was walking through a field that had a small knoll in the middle. He was approaching the knoll when he noticed a huge grizzly bear standing to her feet, only 60 yards away from him. Somehow the knoll had been just high enough to screen the bear from Chris's view and him from hers. Chris's knees immediately began to knock as fear overwhelmed him as soon as he saw the sow's two cubs poke their heads up to see what the sow was looking at. He was way too close to her to be comfortable, and hoped she would catch his scent on the breeze and disappear, but the sow had other plans. Now there had been a real dilemma developing between area farmers and grizzly bears around Grand Prairie. It seemed the hungry bears loved filling themselves up on the delicious oats from the farmers' fields. Fish and Game officers had recently flown over the area in a helicopter and noted seeing 7 grizzly bears in the 4 to 5 square kilometers around the field Chris was scouting. Locals reported finding piles of grizzly bear scat loaded with digested oats, affirming that the bears were raiding the fields to augment their diets. As soon as Chris saw the sow stand to her hind legs, he knew he didn't want to confuse her about what he was. He immediately ripped his face mask off so that she could see he was a human and not a deer or some other delicious animal. The terrified man lifted his arms straight over his head and waved them around frantically as he yelled at her, hoping this display might frighten her away. Right when Chris began to yell, the sow dropped to all fours and began to charge straight toward him. She had apparently seen enough to make a decision on how to handle his close presence to her and her cubs. He was hoping she would veer off or slow down, as he knew there was no way he could outrun her. His only option was to wait and see if she was bluffing, or if her intentions toward him were much more serious. As the grizzly ran toward him, her head was high, and her eyes focused like lasers on Chris. He knew she was not bluffing, and that the outcome of this run-in would be bad. The sow huffed and chuffed her way toward him like some kind of locomotive with teeth. Chris lifted the digital camera he was carrying, hoping the flash would startle her and make her reconsider her options. When the flash didn't go off, he knew the only other weapon he had to defend himself was his hunting knife. Chris lifted his knife above his head and braced for impact. The sow slammed into his gut at full speed, sending him flying backward and his arms flailing to maintain his balance. As his arms reached out, the sow clamped her jaws onto his right forearm, just between his wrist and his elbow. Her momentum drove the bear right through Chris and wrapped him around her neck and shoulders with the impact. Whether it was an act of deliberation or desperation, Chris plunged his hunting knife into the sow just in front of her shoulder at the base of her neck. The blade sank into her flesh clear to the tang, and blood sprayed in every direction. Chris recalled feeling a sudden sensation of warmth all over his body as the grizzly's blood drenched him from his head to his toes. The sow then turned her head and bit into his back. Before she could pull away from him, Chris plunged his hunting knife into her flesh 2 more times in quick succession. After the impact, Chris was lying on the ground, waiting for the next painful bite from the sow, when she turned around and walked away. He could see blood pouring from the huge wounds his hunting knife had opened up in her neck, but was more worried about getting to safety than anything else. The wounded man kept his eyes down to avoid instigating a follow-up attack. Chris cupped his clearly mangled right arm to his body as he quickly made his way toward the edge of the field and away from that angry sow. It only took a few minutes before Chris could find a farmer, who immediately dialed 911 to request medical help. First responders from the Grovedale Fire and Rescue rendered first aid as they transported him to the nearest hospital. At the medical center, Chris's arm was x-rayed and found to have both the radius and ulna bones severely broken. One of the nerves that controlled his hand had been damaged as well. Surgery was required to insert metal plates to repair the damage done to his arm bones and start him on the road to recovery. As for the sow, she was found dead only 30 yards from where her dust-up with Chris had occurred. There was no indication of what had happened to her cubs, nor their age. If they were spring cubs, they would stand no chance of survival without her, and only a slightly higher one if they were from the prior spring. Reflecting on the mishap, Chris says that he was lucky, and acknowledged the bear could have inflicted much more damage on him in the first few moments of the attack. Different scenarios still flashed through his mind, as being at the wrong place at the wrong time and running into the wrong bear continues to haunt him. An outfitter who lives in the area, Dave Coleman, reported spotting the sow and her cubs only a few days before Chris's attack. He expressed admiration in Chris's ability to stay calm and cool in such a desperate situation. Chris indicates that he will bow hunt again after his arm is repaired and rehabilitated fully. He still deals with just how lucky he was, and how things could have ended up very differently for him. This episode reminds me of Jeremy Evans and Gene Moe's attack, which are both episodes on this channel. All 3 episodes featured victims who were tough beyond measure. Which of these 3 do you think was the most amazing bear attack? Post your answers in the comments section. After reviewing the details of this attack, I'm left with a few questions for you. Was Chris just lucky in stabbing the bear in the perfect spot during the attack? Would you consider a hunting knife with a 12-inch blade a good grizzly bear deterrent? How many things can you list that Chris did wrong in the lead-up to the attack? I'll be glad to read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to Denali National Park in central Alaska once again. The park's highway travels from Anchorage in the south to Fairbanks in the north. As the highway skirts Denali, the Denali Park Road heads west and takes travelers for about 50 miles through the park's heart. This road twists and turns along rivers and climbs to ridgetops featuring unsurpassed views of pristine territory. Given this road grants visitors such unparalleled access, it also brings hikers and photographers and all sorts of nature lovers. The lush green forests of poplar, birch, larch, and aspen trees accommodate stands of fir and spruce trees, leaving the banks of streams and rivers to willow and alder stands. With hiking trails breaking off from the road periodically, trekkers are free to access remote regions of the park to view moose, caribou, and sheep that wander the hillsides. As they climb and side-hill the trails, hikers are frequently not expecting to run into any of the predators of this area, which include bobcats, black bears, coyotes, lynx, wolves, and brown bears. Even in this peaceful and beautiful area, a close encounter of the clawed kind may leave a person in extreme peril. On July 21, 1972, 22-year-old Chris Cobble was enjoying a lonesome hike along the Toklat River about 1.5 miles south of the Denali Park Highway, just east of Divide Mountain. The gravel bars were easier to walk than some trails this time of year, as the plants grow quickly with the additional hours of daylight. Crowding the trail sides and blocking visibility for hikers means that the plants can be a real impediment to safety. As Chris navigated the gravel bar, he glanced ahead of him to make sure he didn't surprise any grizzly bears that may be feeding on salmon or berries along the river. About 3/4 of a mile ahead of him, he saw the shape of a massive grizzly bear stand out from the green plants surrounding it. It was located near the bottom of one of the hillsides, and Chris determined he would find a wide route around the bear to avoid any confrontation with it. After looking over the lay of the land, he decided on a route and headed in that direction. As he climbed, making sure to stay a few hundred yards away from the bear, he kept in mind the bear's approximate location with his. He'd hoped that he could find a spot uphill from the bears and watch it for a while, just to see what it was up to. As curiosity frequently does, it got the best of Chris. He'd hiked the route he'd planned on in hopes of avoiding the bear, but had the bear stayed where it was when Chris had started? What if the bear had unexpectedly decided to head up the hill in Chris's direction, and he didn't know it? Being so close to such a dangerous predator can play tricks on your mind, and all Chris needed was to rid himself of such anxious thoughts. Chris climbed a small knob and hoped that it would lend him a view of the bear's previous location. He took off his backpack and laid it at the bottom of the rise before stepping his way toward the point. His curiosity got the best of him as he leaned out over the knob and peered through the brush below him. As he searched the area below him, he suddenly saw a brown blur out of one of the corners of his eye. Chris craned his head toward the blur and noticed 2 half-grown grizzly cubs to his right, about 100 yards away from him. They were slowly making their way toward him. It occurred to him that if there were 2 cubs, then there must be at least one sow very near them. That is when his stomach tied itself into knots, and he had a sense of impending doom overwhelm him. Just as Chris had stepped back from the edge of the knoll, a huge sow grizzly bear stepped into view, only about 120 yards from him. She was down the hill from the cubs a short distance and seemed very concerned about how far from her they'd traveled. Chris tried to slink away before catching her eye, but grizzlies who don't pay attention don't survive. Chris was filled with terror as he watched the sow's head snap in his direction. Her intense gaze let him know that she was aware of his presence, and her actions let him know she was not happy about it. After only a few seconds of staring at him, the sow planted her back feet in the soil and took the first of only a few bounds toward him. Chris immediately began backing up and yelling at the sow. His only hope was that she was bluffing and only trying to frighten him away from her cubs. He quickly made his way down the slope a few yards, trying to escape from her line of sight. The sow covered the 120 yards between them in what may have only been 4 or 5 seconds. As soon as she got near Chris, she began swatting him with her massive paws and raking him with her claws. Near a large willow bush, the sow pushed Chris onto his back. Her claws had already torn gashes into his right leg, and her teeth tore a few more holes into it to boot. Chris immediately knew his best bet was to roll onto his stomach and remain still. He flipped over and covered his head and face with his arms, in hopes of limiting the damage done to them. Now face down, Chris could feel the angry sow slashing at his back and arms. She was biting anything that she could reach with her jaws and clawing anything else. Just as he felt her teeth tearing his scalp on the back of his head, the sow disappeared. Although her angry attack was a mere 5 seconds in length, it had done more damage to Chris's body than most car accidents. He could feel his blood seeping from wounds all over his body and the warmth of it as it ran down his cheeks. Chris was too afraid to look and see where the sow was. He lay there, frozen, and waiting for a follow-up attack, but it never came. The forest was silent, and the river churned below him. After several seconds, Chris peeked through his fingers at the surrounding brush. The worst-case scenario would be that he would see her sitting and staring at him from a few yards away, but she was nowhere to be found. Chris listened for any sign that the bears were nearby, but was met with silence. Over the next few minutes, Chris began to gain confidence that the sow had left him. He slowly rose to his knees and searched cautiously, just to make sure of his hopes. Once he was confident she was not near him, he slowly climbed to his feet. Chris's first thoughts must have been how to get out of there and back to safety and civilization as quickly as possible, but he still wasn't certain of the direction in which the bears had left. If they'd fled toward the Denali Park Road, then he might run right back into them. He soon realized that it was a chance he would have to take. Chris began to assess a few of his wounds that were easily examined. They were bad and painful, but they were not serious enough to prevent him from hiking out. Slowly and cautiously, he picked his way back through the brush and along the gravel bar toward the road. He would have about 1.5 miles of a hike to get to the safety of the road, and completed it in record time, while glancing over his shoulder the entire way. Once safely out, Chris was able to flag down other park visitors. He was transported to the hospital, where his wounds were cleaned and sutured closed. All told, the sow had left him with gashes on his right leg, along his arms, and across his back. Her teeth had punched large holes in his right leg and along parts of his back. She had also bitten the back of his head, though she did not crush his skull. Chris had battled a grizzly sow, and was left with the scars to prove it. As far as the sow and cubs go, there is no record of the rangers doing anything to kill or capture them. The sow's attack on Chris was viewed as a defensive attack, given that she was defending her cubs from a perceived threat. She'd left without burying Chris, and did not stick around to defend him as her food. After reviewing the harrowing details of this attack, I am left with a few questions for you. Would you consider hiking in Denali after hearing the details of Chris's attack? Do you think the cubs witnessed anything that they may repeat in their own lives? How much more damage could the sow have done to Chris in the few seconds she had him at her mercy? I'll be glad to read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the agricultural fields surrounding Cody, Wyoming. When you think of grizzly bear attacks, a cornfield isn't the first background that comes to mind. But this area isn't just farm fields. The Shoshone National Forest surrounds it and is only about 30 miles east of Yellowstone National Park. The land between the park and the farmland is remote and rugged mountains with uninterrupted forests of pine, fir, and spruce trees along the ridges. The Shoshone National Forest is on the eastern slope of the Great Divide, and all the waters that fill the creeks head toward the Mississippi River. Down in the valleys, willows and berry bushes screen the creek banks for the animals that live there. Moose, mule deer, elk, and antelope are common sights here. Black bears, bobcats, cougars, grizzly bears, and wolves stalk the trails while they raise the next generation of predators. Although the ridges and hillsides may be as wild as they've ever been, the agricultural areas in the valleys are dotted with ranches and farms. The water that feeds the creeks and streams is often diverted to water the corn, wheat, and alfalfa that grows here. It may be too remote for most people, but the hardy people of western Wyoming wouldn't live anywhere else. This lifestyle demands hard work, which shapes and conditions the people who work the land. On Thursday, June 20th, 2013, 65-year-old Nick Patrick had beaten the sun out of bed and was headed toward his fields. The creek beds around Nick's fields were crowded with brush and smaller trees that hid pheasants, grouse, and deer. They were all common sights in the early morning hours and were always a pleasant surprise for Nick. Nick was a big supporter of the protection of grizzly bears in Wyoming. He served on the Greater Yellowstone Coalition Board, which strives to preserve vital habitats, create travel corridors for wildlife, and connect human allies to support these resources. Nick had even hosted board meetings at his ranch in recent years. This week Nick had a handful of special visitors to his ranch. His oldest daughter had brought her 4 children to visit Grandpa on the ranch, but Nick didn't let that pull him away from his work. He would complete the day's work, then visit with them afterward, catching up on all the fun events that had transpired in their lives. As Nick worked his way along the ditch bank, his dog began to bark incessantly a short distance away. Raccoons were common in the area, and Nick assumed the dog had run into another one. He picked up his shovel and headed toward the gully, located about 50 yards from where he was working in the field. Just as Nick began to walk down into the gully, he could see his dog. It was barking toward the brush along the creek, but what he was barking at wasn't very clear. Before Nick could gain control of the dog, a huge sow grizzly stormed from the brush, followed closely by her 2 cubs. Grizzly bears are not an uncommon sight around Cody, especially on the hills above Nick's fields. They can be seen grazing their way across green meadows from the roads in springtime. Once in a while, a problem will arise with a bear killing livestock or raiding grain supplies, but generally they keep to themselves. They tend to avoid anything affiliated with humans as much as possible. Once the sow set her eyes on Nick, there wasn't much taking her attention away from him. She quickly covered the ground between them at a rate that didn't afford Nick any time to think, let alone react. He could see her massive shoulder muscles ripple with each stride as she streaked toward him. It was clear by her immense size that Nick could not fight her, and he knew good and well there was no sense in trying to outrun her. Nick had only one weapon at his side, his trusty shovel. He picked it up like a baseball bat and did his best impression of Babe Ruth upside the grizzly's head. As the shovel smacked against the sow's skull, Nick soon realized the noise it made was the worst part. The grizzly wasn't bothered by the blow from the shovel and didn't slow down in her progress toward him. Given he had put all of his energy into swinging the shovel, Nick was briefly left in a twisted posture. Both of his arms were holding the shovel, which was now to his left and behind him. This pose left his face pointed toward the bear, with nothing to protect it. The angry sow used the awkward position Nick's shovel swing had left him in, and clamped her jaws around his entire face. Her canines sank in from cheekbone to cheekbone, and when she closed her jaws, she peeled off the skin between them, including Nick's nose. The cracking and popping of his cheekbones drowned out all the other noise Nick could hear. The sow pulled the mouthful of Nick's face away, while pressing his shoulders with her paws. As the sow loosened her grip on Nick's face, she slid her jaws down his body to his left knee. Clamping her jaws onto it, she dragged him about 20 feet, puncturing and tearing flesh as she did so. Now missing most of the middle part of his face and fearing the sow was going to continue her attack, Nick flipped onto his stomach. Playing dead must have seemed like the best option, as resistance was clearly futile. He was hoping that he could cover up any vulnerable parts of himself that she hadn't yet bit into, but for some reason the sow suddenly changed her mind. It may have been thoughts of her cubs, or perhaps she felt Nick was no longer a danger. Either way, the sow disappeared into the brush as Nick lay on his stomach. As he lifted his head from the soil, Nick could feel his upper lip flopping against his chin. He knew this grizzly had done some terrifying damage to his face, so he reached into his pocket in search of his cell phone. He pulled the phone out and quickly dialed 911, hoping to find a calming professional on the other end. Unfortunately for Nick, the gully he was in was without reception, and no one answered his call for help. Upon seeing him moving, the grizzly sow bounded back in Nick's direction. She must have figured he was dead when she left, and was a bit angered to see he wasn't. This time she bit onto the back of his head and chewed up his scalp real good. Like the unwilling participant in some kind of sadistic game, Nick jerked and screamed each time the sow bit into a different area than she had previously. The pressure from her jaws was the most overwhelming sensation. Nick had never felt such pain before in his life, and felt the bear's canines piercing his flesh and slamming against his bones, with crunches that resonated through his body. Her claws and teeth punched quick holes and gashes through Nick's vest and back before she dashed back into the brush. As soon as she left him, Nick peeked up the gully to see her gather her cubs and leave. He continued to watch the bears as they disappeared from sight, hoping that she would not return for a third round. Nick pulled himself together and began assessing his wounds, at least those that he could see. His most devastating injury was clearly out of his view, but he could feel the middle part of his face was missing. It may have been the adrenaline, but Nick knew he had to get to medical help as quickly as possible. There was no one walking along that gully any time soon, in all likelihood, and Nick couldn't afford to wait for help. He slowly worked his way to his feet and staggered toward his home, which was a few hundred yards away. After reaching his home, he stumbled his way back to his shop. Nick knew his grandkids would run outside to see him as soon as he arrived, and he knew that the damage the sow had inflicted on his face would terrify them. He immediately stumbled into his workshop in search of a towel, trailing blood behind him. Wiping the blood and other bodily fluids from his face, Nick eventually found the towel he was looking for and draped it over his head. Then he staggered toward the house to ask them to call for medical help. When first responders arrived, they loaded Nick into the ambulance and rushed him toward West Park Hospital in Cody. As soon as he arrived, the medical staff there recognized that his wounds were far too severe for treatment from their facility. They arranged for a medical helicopter to transport Nick to the University of Colorado Hospital in Aurora, Colorado. He was stabilized there and remained in the intensive care unit while a ventilator helped him breathe. The middle of Nick's face, including his nose and all the skin between his cheekbones, had completely been removed. The risk of infection was immediately identified, given the injuries to his sinuses only a few inches from his brain. Wyoming Game and Fish officers began an investigation into the cause and circumstances of Nick's grizzly bear attack. They set out culvert traps along the gullies and fields in the area, hoping to catch the bears before any further incidents could occur. If they caught the sow, they could check her for a lip tattoo or an ear tag to gauge whether she had been a problem bear or if this was simply an isolated incident. They were not considering euthanizing the sow without knowing her background, if there was one at all. The wardens found the sow's tracks and followed them away from the agricultural areas in the valley. The bears had departed for more remote areas away from people. Given she would not likely encounter any more people in the location she had ended up at, they decided to stop tracking her, for now. Wardens decided the grizzly sow had reacted to a perceived threat to herself and her cubs. As severe as it was, the attack was deemed a defensive attack. Nick's dog ended up with a long gash down his back, but recovered from his run-in with the grizzly. Nick's efforts had likely saved his dog's life, but nearly cost him his own. As Nick slowly recovered in the ICU, his friends sent prayers and messages of support. They noted that being in good physical condition probably contributed to him surviving the severe mauling. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. Would the sow have left after the initial attack if he had played dead? Did the presence of the dog add an aggravating circumstance for the grizzly? Do you think this sow should be pursued and killed after such a brutal mauling? I will gladly read and respond to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the Appalachian Trail near a town called Glasgow, Virginia. The AT, as it is known in hiking circles, starts or ends at the peak of Springer Mountain on the border of Fannin and Gilmer counties in North Georgia. It winds its way through the states of Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont, and New Hampshire, and ends in Maine. Most of the states that the AT goes through have bear attacks that have been featured on one episode or another on our channel. It covers 2,198.4 miles, and most of those miles are through prime bear habitat. The trail hosts about 3 million hikers each year, and most of those are day hikers. Through hiking, by contrast, is hiking the entire trail in one 12-month period from beginning to end. It requires much more planning and discipline, as coordinating the supply drops and support materials can be logistically challenging. As you can imagine, the topography and geography of the trail varies, but primarily consists of steep peaks and trails piercing through thick forests of pine, maple, fir, oak, spruce, and hickory. The undergrowth over most of the trail length is so thick that visibility is limited to under a few yards in much of it. Animals that you may run into while hiking include white-tailed deer, elk, turkeys, and a myriad of smaller animals like skunks, possums, and raccoons. The predators along the AT include bobcats, coyotes, and black bears. Near the tiny town of Glasgow, Virginia, the AT crosses the James River. Due to the proximity of the town, AT hikers often stop there to stock up on supplies before continuing on their trek. Resting near a restocking location allows some hikers to refresh not only their supplies, but also their spirits. They pitch their tents and campsites dedicated to them along the trail and approaching the town. Lilliantown were AT through hikers and were about 2 months into their hike when they reached the area around Glasgow. The month was May 2023, but as you can imagine, after hiking for 2 months, the pair had no idea what the precise day of the month was. Given that weather doesn't always cooperate with hiking plans, and motivation varies day by day, the couple didn't generally hold too tightly to reaching their waypoints in their planned route. Taking it day by day and camping in enchanting places instead of your planned locations add to the freedom and adventure of the experience. On the day in question, the hikers had reached their last big climb of the day by late afternoon and were searching for a place to pitch camp for the night. Hoping to cover a few more miles before that, they decided that they would pitch camp around 7:30 p.m., wherever they found themselves to be. Previously in the day, they'd crossed a road to re-enter the trailhead where they'd met up with some hikers headed in the other direction. As they passed each other, the hiking group conveyed that the campground known as Matt's Creek Shelter was closed due to a bear being seen in the area. Lily and Town thanked the hikers for their information and continued on their way up the trail. Given that their waypoints weren't etched in stone, Lily and Town weren't exactly sure how far Matt's Creek Shelter was. They weren't sure if they were even planning on staying there, but decided to cross that bridge when they got to it. Bear activity was a common topic of conversation for the hikers on the AT, so the fact that it was mentioned didn't draw too much attention from either of the hikers. They'd already passed several signs relaying the fact that bears had stolen food caches suspended from trees, so reports of bear activity were not as alarming as they should have been. Now, Matt's Creek Shelter lies on the west side of the James River. Lily and Town were close to pitching camp for the night, and it was the nearest campsite to them. Their options were to stop before Matt's Creek or to cross the river before pitching camp. As they hiked, they passed a beautiful campsite, which was still outside the boundary of the closed portion of the trail. The campsite had a great view of the James River and was technically outside the closed area, but only by a little bit. The day's hike was grueling at times, and rolling out their bedrolls on the thick layer of pine duff was all too comfortable. Lily and Town wolfed down their dinner and cached their food about 50 yards from their campsite, safely out of the reach of any hungry bears. The method they used to cache their food bag is called the PCT method, named after the recommended method used along the Pacific Crest Trail. It requires suspending your food bag over a high limb no lower than 12 feet from the ground. The cache should be more than 6 feet from the tree trunk and 4 feet lower than the branch to prevent bears from climbing the tree and pulling the rope toward themselves. For those of you who are interested in learning this caching technique, I've linked to an instructional video in the video article below this video. On a side note, rangers along the trail system have noted that bears have watched hikers as they cache their food bags. They've learned that untying the knot tethering the cache to the base of the same tree can yield free meals. The PCT method of caching can disrupt this learning-based reward system, even though it may take up to 30 years for the bears that have learned this lesson to fade from the population. At about 8:45 p.m., Lily and Town settled into their sleeping bags as the darkness chased the last bit of twilight from the evening sky. The nighttime noises of the forest surrounded the hikers, and their slumber had only started by the time it was unceremoniously interrupted. A little after 9 p.m., Lily was awakened by the sound of heavy, deep breaths through her tent and very close to her face. Hoping it was part of a dream, she froze and listened to confirm her fears. The sound of sniffing disrupted her consolation and was followed by the sound of very heavy footfalls, which made their way around the tent. Judging by the thud of the footfalls, Lily knew this was no small animal. It could only have been a large bear. She shook Town from his sleep and told him there was a bear outside their tent. The two raised a chorus of "Hey bear" for over a minute, hoping that it would be all the animal would need to be convinced to leave them alone. Each chorus was followed by attentive listening, as the hikers eagerly awaited for the sound of departing footfalls. As soon as the bear heard the humans, it was likely perplexed by its lack of ability to visually locate them. It huffed loudly and stomped toward them, but given it didn't see them, stomped on the ground at the edge of their tent. It seemed the bear was trying to flush them from their hiding spot by bluff charging them. Given the bear didn't immediately crash through the brush in a hasty departure, Town knew this was a bad situation. He ordered Lily to call 911. After barking out the order, he reached over to retrieve his knife and a whistle he carried in his backpack. Lily pulled out her cell phone and had somehow managed to get 2 bars of reception. The location they chose was narrowly sufficient to place the call for emergency services. Town stammered out that this wasn't a normal bear, as it wasn't scared of them. He blew loud blasts from his whistle and thumped on the tent poles to frighten the bear away. Lily would be connected with the Blue Ridge Parkway deputies for the next 90 long minutes. Now, usually when a caller dials 911, they're in or near a house, road, or other landmark they can relay their location. Lily and Town were out in the woods, and realistically beyond the typical service area of first responders. The dispatchers went back and forth with Lily, trying to understand exactly how responders could get to them, but they were not familiar with the trail and its intricacies. After ironing out the hikers' rough location, dispatch sent responders to the camp, but they were at least 30 minutes away. Lily and Town were instructed to stay inside their tent, but expressed that they were not comfortable staying inside it because they couldn't see the bear. They thought that trying to make it back out to nearby Highway 3 would be a safer bet, but they were overruled by the dispatcher. If responders could not locate them, they would not be able to ensure the safety of the hikers. As responders scrambled to round up a means to reach the hikers, the bear huffed and chuffed at them through the tent fabric. The hikers positioned themselves as far away from the tent edges as possible and huddled in fear as the time passed slowly. As they waited for responders, Lily received a call from the wildlife officer. The officer inquired about where their food was cached, and Lily explained how they'd stored it. After confirming it was cached properly, the officer asked where they had cooked their food in relation to their tent. Lily explained that their cooking location was only about 10 yards from their tent. After receiving that information, the officer asked them if there was any way they could cover up that location with something. The officer's next line of questioning was regarding protection. He asked them if they'd brought a firearm along with them. Lily indicated that they only had a knife. The officer advised them to take the knife and a few other things to throw at the bear as they left the tent. After all, the bear shouldn't be interested in eating the people, only wanted the food it smelled. By this time, Town's headlamp was out of battery power, as was his cell phone, while both of Lily's devices were just about there. The couple had decided that staying in the tent was a greater risk than leaving it. They planned to quickly hike their way through the dark to Highway 3, where help would be waiting, hopefully. Lily gathered 2 water containers and the knife sheath to throw at the bear as they made their escape from the tent. They planned for Town to leave the tent first, closely followed by Lily and her headlamp. Looking around, Town couldn't locate the bear in the darkness. Lily emerged from the tent and immediately located it using her headlamp. It was standing only 15 feet away, sniffing the ground. Lily began launching her impromptu projectile collection in the bear's direction. As each item landed near it, the bear showed little to no reaction. The only reaction the hikers got from the bear was a blank and prolonged stare. Lily and Town backed away from the bear and toward the bushes that lined the trail on their escape route. The bear didn't do anything but watch them as they slowly made their way. As soon as the bear disappeared from their sight, the hikers took several quick steps in the opposite direction before they heard a rustling from the bushes nearby them. The rustling noise was not coming from their campsite, but from the opposite direction. The hikers watched in horror as a second black bear stepped onto the trail, only about 20 feet from where they stood. Lily was still on the phone with the 911 dispatcher and let fly a few expletives as she saw the second bear. At this point, Town was carrying his knife and empty backpack, while Lily had only her dying phone and headlamp. The dispatcher relayed instructions to the hikers to back slowly away from the bear, while keeping an eye on it. This was the start of a terrifying game of cat and mouse. As the hikers slowly crept backward down the trail, the bear maintained their pace. It stayed the same distance away from them as they went. Lily relayed the bear's persistence to the dispatcher, who asked them if they had anything with scent they could drop. The only thing that they could afford to lay down was Town's backpack, so he placed it on the trail, and they slowly retreated from it. As the bear lumbered toward Town's backpack, it lowered its nose to it. It sniffed quick puffs and then raised its head once again. An agonizing sensation took over Town and Lily as they watched the paws of the bear reach past the backpack and in their direction. Lily began to lose her composure after watching the bear continue past the backpack. Her excited and fearful tone relayed to the dispatcher that the bear was still following them and that they had nothing it could want. But she was thinking that this was a typical bear and not a bear considering humans as prey. That is when one of their few remaining connections with the outside world collapsed. Lily's connection with the dispatcher had dropped, and with it the hikers' spirits. A sensation of unfairness washed over Lily as she considered that they had done everything to distract the bear. It couldn't possibly be interested in humans as food, but could only be interested in them as a food source. What more could it want? They dropped everything with a scent that attracted the bear. It was at this point that the hikers noticed that the bear was slowly closing the short distance between them. Town positioned himself between Lily and the bear. His 3-inch knife blade would be very little protection against an animal whose hide was designed to resist claws of about the same length. He continued to yell at the bear, and his voice was getting hoarse as they continued their retreat down the trail. The desperation the hikers were feeling mounted as the bear stalked to within 8 feet of them. That is when Lily realized that Town's knife wasn't the only weapon they could use to defend themselves. She noticed they were standing on a very rocky part of the trail and bent over to retrieve a handful of golf ball-sized rocks. Taking his cue from Lily, Town reached down and grabbed his own small arsenal of rocks. The hikers began pelting the bear and likely didn't miss much from only 8 feet away. At last, a break in the focus of the bear appeared as it retreated a short distance up the trunk of a tree along the trail. Town and Lily used this break in the bear's stalk toward them to put more distance between him and them. After only a few seconds, the bear dropped back down to the trail and continued its methodical stalk toward the hikers. Now having formulated a rudimentary strategy to defend themselves, the hikers played out their role in a play that had likely been performed countless times over the eons. The bear would advance on them, and they would throw rocks at it, driving it back from them. With each rock that thumped into the bear's ribs, they could see it begin to doubt whether stalking them was worth the risk, but it continued to return nonetheless. The shortest route to the protection of civilization took Lily and Town right through the closed section of the trail and past Matt's Creek shelter. Lily would glance back behind them as they hiked and noticed that the distance between them and the bear's glowing eyes was increasing. By the time the hikers had crossed the bridge and climbed the shoulder on the side of the highway, they'd covered 3 miles while being stalked by the bear. They glanced up and down the dark highway, hoping to see a waiting deputy, but there was nothing. There was no cell reception either, so calling for help was out of the question. It was now about 11:15 p.m., and they knew their only option was to head toward Glasgow, so they began hiking through the dark. At least they felt safer hiking along the road. There would certainly be someone driving by soon, and hopefully they would get a ride into town. It wasn't long before headlights appeared from around the bend, and Lily waved her cell phone, hoping to get the car to pull over. It roared right past them, likely too afraid to pick up hitchhikers in the middle of the night. Town was still carrying his knife in his hand when another car appeared coming from the opposite direction. The driver pulled over to the shoulder and asked Lily to approach his vehicle, likely uncertain of just what was going on with them. After some serious consideration, the driver confessed that he couldn't leave them out here in good conscience, and agreed to take them to town. Lily and Town managed to secure a sleeping spot at the hostel in town called Stanimals. In the morning they met with Ranger Brian Wilson. They all agreed to go back to their campsite to retrieve their backpacking gear they had discarded in their retreat. Ranger Wilson grabbed his pump-action shotgun loaded with slugs, and the trio headed up the trail together. About a half-mile from their previous campsite, the ranger pointed out some food wrappers in the trail. Lily sheepishly explained that those were hers, and she'd discarded them as the bear followed them down the trail the night before. Continuing up the trail, the group located one of Town's shoes. It had a clear puncture hole through the toe where one of the bears tested its taste. A short distance further they found Town's backpack he'd discarded in the trail to distract the bear. The same one they had watched the bear step over as it stalked them. His pack was now torn up and its contents strewn about. As the group climbed the remaining trail section of their campsite, they began to wonder what damage may have been done to their belongings. Upon arriving, they could see that their food cache was completely untouched, and the ranger indicated that their food was properly cached, possibly too well. It appeared that the bears had opted for easier food than the food cache offered. Upon examining their tent, they could see both of the hikers' sleeping pads were punctured, and Lily's toiletry bag was ripped apart and scattered just outside. Their sleeping bags were slashed in places, and Town's more so than Lily's. The tent had clear claw marks from the bear's paws striking at it after they'd fled. As Ranger Wilson took pictures of the campsite, he pointed out that just beyond the tent's ground cloth was a large bear print in the duff. He indicated that this situation was very dangerous and may have ended up very badly for the hikers. He informed them that they were nearly a Netflix documentary. Reacting to the aggressive nature of the bears, AT authorities increased the closed area to keep people from entering the bear's location. Ranger Wilson indicated that the bear near their tent was a large sow, and that the bear that had followed them through the trees was a 2-year-old bear. It was likely not as big as the sow, but certainly large enough to harm or kill unarmed people. Trail authorities decided to wait until the berry season started before relocating the bears. Given this was the second time they'd responded to these bears behaving aggressively toward hikers, their actions may be too little, too late someday. Lily and Town continued on their AT adventure through the next few nights, though the next few nights were not comfortable, given that they had to sleep on their deflated sleeping pads. Lily blogged about their hike along the AT, and if you are interested in reading it, I've linked to it at the bottom of the video article below. I'm sure they would appreciate any support you care to offer. After reviewing the details of this episode, I have a few questions for you. Given that the bears returned to the items Town and Lily discarded, do you think that indicates a predatory nature to this confrontation? Would you have remained in the tent or fled? Would you have finished hiking the AT after having such a harrowing run-in with bears? I will gladly read and respond to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us back to the same location as our prior episode, the Tuscarora Trail Overlook in Duthat State Park in Virginia. The steep hills of this park are packed with dense, mixed forests of evergreens and deciduous trees. The deciduous trees drop their leaves each fall, which forms a crunchy and insulating layer along the ground. This layer performs an important function in the habitat, but we will not get into that in this video. The evergreen trees here include pine, fir, spruce, and hemlock trees, which create a dark environment that allows predators to sneak up on prey very easily. With white-tailed deer and turkeys wandering the underbrush, life here is easy for the bobcats, coyotes, and black bears with plenty to eat. As reported in the prior episodes, Virginia hosts 17,000 black bears, which is likely not going down, despite the state's broad hunting seasons. Unlike black bears in the western states, bears in Virginia are almost always black in color, and they lack any variation in their color. On the afternoon of September 17, 2017, a woman whom we will refer to as Carol was out for a relaxing hike through the beautiful mountains of the park with her 2 dogs. Duke and Daisy trotted along the trailside, sniffing anything that presented an alluring scent and obediently answering Carol's calls to them. For several miles the dogs kept Carol company and alertly watched for anything that interested them. They undoubtedly smelled deer and raccoons as they braided their paths along the trail, but on this day, one scent seemed to elude their sensitive noses for an unknown reason. Spending much of the day making their way toward the overlook just past the peak of the trail, Carol and her dogs were now a few hours and numerous miles into their hike. I could find no source confirming that Carol carried bear spray or a firearm on this hike, so it is believed she carried neither. Sometimes as people and dogs get tired, they begin to lose attention to fine details. At first, hikers are alert and watching for anything out of place or different. After a few thousand steps, important clues may be missed. As Carol and her dogs approached the overlook about 1 p.m., they must have walked right past a very dangerous observer concealed by the brush near the trail. It isn't clear whether the black bear had followed them unnoticed down the trail or if it had suddenly appeared behind them. Hiking down the trail, Carol was staring ahead of her when she was driven forward and onto her face. The impact came from nowhere and briefly disoriented Carol, but the searing pain and pressure of a hungry black bear's teeth being driven into the flesh of her lower leg brought her back to reality. As Carol rolled to her side, she could see a black bear latched onto her leg and started to kick at the bear with her other leg. As the bear slashed her legs with its paws while it tried to fend off her kicks, the puncture wounds in her legs tore and bled. After a couple of well-placed kicks to the bear's head, it switched its attack to her other leg. It caught her lower leg in its jaws and shook its head to set its teeth deep in her flesh. Thoughts of what to do must have raced through her mind as she determined how to handle this violent attack. Carol kicked and yelled as the bear bit into her legs over and over while it clawed and gashed them. She knew this bear was not defending itself, as it came from behind to attack her. Realizing this was a fight for her life, Carol resolved to fight to the end. As the bear bit and tore at Carol's legs, her dogs ran around, barking and charging toward the bear. Their dashing and darting confused the bear and distracted it from killing Carol. With so much energy and resistance, the bear's resolve began to wane. It released its grip on Carol's legs and darted back into the brush, leaving her bleeding and in pain on the ground. As her dogs chased after the bear a short distance, Carol pulled herself together. The last thing she knew, she was enjoying the beautiful scenery, and the next thing she knew, she was sitting here after such a sudden and brutal attack. Carol pulled her legs underneath her and stood to her feet. The adrenaline had dulled the pain of the puncture and claw wounds on her legs, but that didn't last. She could see her blood trickling from wounds that hurt, and wondered if she should sit and wait for another hiker to come along, or risk returning down the same trail she'd just been ambushed on. After some consideration, she knew that waiting would leave her in the same area as the aggressive bear, and that was a risk she was unwilling to take. She decided that enduring the pain she felt with each step was more tolerable than the thought of waiting. Slowly, Carol began working her way down the trail while calling to her dogs. They'd returned from chasing the bear and seemed uninjured. After a few hours of painful limping her way down the trail, Carol emerged at the trailhead and her vehicle parked there. Somehow she managed to get through to emergency services and requested first responders to her location. Carol was transported to the same hospital that Laura Cooksey was treated at, Lewis Gale Hospital, Allegheny. Her gashes and puncture wounds were cleaned and closed with an undisclosed number of stitches after she was transferred to the Roanoke Memorial Hospital. Over the next few weeks, Carol would make a full recovery. Wildlife officials would initiate a comprehensive search for the bear, and due to the predatory nature of the attack, decided it would have to be euthanized. DNA evidence from the bear was collected from Carol's wounds for comparison with other bears they suspected of her attack. They noted that rabies could be a factor in Carol's attack. During Carol's recovery, the park system took care of her family cabin in the area and her dogs. They expressed wishes for a speedy recovery for her after experiencing such a violent, unprovoked attack. Officials closed the trails in the park as they searched for the bear. There was no indication in any of the sources I could find on this attack whether the bear was ever located or killed. Following the attack, officials released a public announcement advising hikers and campers to remain calm if they encounter a bear. They also stated that hiking during dawn or dusk hours may increase the likelihood of running into a bear. Making noise near streams and brushy areas may help avoid surprising a bear. Keeping your children close to you may ensure their safety. When you confront a bear, appear as large as possible and make noise while retreating slowly. Given Carol was hiking when she was attacked from behind, this advice had limited value in preventing it. She was ambushed at midday and wasn't near a stream or an area of dense brush, or at least any more dense than the rest of her surroundings. A predatory attack like this one has an element of unpredictability, and no amount of precaution or preparation would have prevented it. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. What could Carol have done differently to avoid or prevent this attack? Is Virginia developing into a hotspot for bear attacks, like other regions? Why didn't Carol's dogs pick up on the bear's presence before it attacked her? What do you think you would do if you were thrown to your face by the impact of a surprise bear attack? I'll be glad to read and respond to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the Tuscarora Overlook Trail in Duthat State Park near Millboro, Virginia. The hills here stretch about 3,200 feet in elevation, which is high for the Appalachian Range. They're covered in dense growths of oak, maple, and hickory trees that drop their leaves each fall. The evergreens here include pine, fir, spruce, and hemlock trees with pawpaw, black willow, dogwood, and magnolia bushes displaying their brilliant flowers and fruits to keen observers from any species. Wild game animals here include white-tailed deer and turkeys, but raccoons and skunks are also common. Predators in this area include bobcats, coyotes, and black bears. According to the Duthat Park Trail Guide linked below, the Tuscarora Overlook Trail runs several miles into the forest on the west side of the park. It executes hairpins in the trail wherever it climbs, granting hikers amazing views. The emerald greenery shimmers down the valley as the breezes rustle the leaves, like they're under some kind of magic spell. Around 5:30 p.m. on Saturday, August 8, 2015, 52-year-old Lori Cooksey was hiking the trail and enjoying the outdoors with her family. Along with Lori were her children. Ellis, who was age 19, Hannah was age 16, and Blake was age 22. All enjoyed being active with their mother. It wasn't long into the hike before energetic Ellis disappeared ahead of the other three group members. The dips and turns in the trail created new sights and adventures for the hikers, and the fresh air invigorated them. The family was close and had gone on several hiking adventures together in the past, but today's events would cast a new light on the possibilities the forest presents. Their plans had consisted of hiking treks mixed in with paddling a canoe in the reservoirs in the area. There was nothing in the sources that indicated that they had brought bear spray or a firearm on their hike that day, so it's accepted they had brought neither. Ellis was ahead of the group when a small black bear showed itself on the trail ahead of him. The bear was partially concealed behind a small pine tree, but quickly began to slowly and steadily stalk toward the group. The hikers had already reached the peak in the trail and were on their descent when they ran into the bear. It was only 15 feet away from Ellis and suddenly rose to its hind legs as if it were comparing its size with the young man's. With his mother arriving and standing beside him, Ellis was in a quandary about precisely how to handle the situation. You see, Ellis has always held a deep-seated fear of bears. On each hike they've gone on, they used 3 owl hoots as a universal alert of a bear sighting as an inside joke, more than anything serious. As she looked at the bear, Lori could see a strange look in the bear's eyes. She stated that she and Ellis wouldn't soon forget that look. I've seen this look in person and up close in run-ins with black bears in Idaho. That look is that of absolute indifference, as the animal seemingly calculates the calories expended versus the calories spent, or the risk of injury gathering those calories. The economy of calories that bears have to tally is one that pits a prey animal versus a predator, and the reconciliation of an equation in which no person wants to be on the short side. Ellis and Lori couldn't help but break formation and run for their lives. The look the bear had given them shook them to their core and instilled terror. As the duo fled, the bear seemed to anticipate their route and cut them off. It had spent its entire life either learning how to or practicing catching up on its prey, and this prey wasn't fleet of foot. Lori was trailing Ellis as they ran from the bear, which put her first in line to be caught by it. The bear chuffed as it closed in on her and swatted her in the small of her back, opening up several gashes in her flesh. Seeing no other alternative, they flung themselves down the steep mountainside, hoping that the bear would give up and leave them alone. That day had been a rainy one, and the mud and moist foliage helped the hikers as they slid downhill on their rear ends. Given gravity has her way with any body of mass, they were soon tumbling more than they were sliding. This tactic didn't confuse or discourage the bear, as it immediately pursued them in their downhill escape. As the bear caught up to Lori, it sank its teeth into the back of her knee and shook its head violently. The wounds it opened up are too graphic for YouTube standards, so I've posted them on my Patreon link, posted below. They're not the worst we display there, but reveal the power and devastation these predators can impart on their victims. Now realizing she may be fighting for her life, Lori kicked viciously at the bear. She put so much ticked-off mama power behind her kicks that the small sow bear slipped on the mud and rolled onto her back. This gave Ellis and Lori space and time to flee once again. As the hikers fled back up the trail, they screamed at Blake and Hannah, telling them to run. At one point, Lori turned and punched the bear, exhibiting her own mama bear power to defend her cubs. Blake had recently graduated from the College of William and Mary and approached the situation with a more academic mindset. Initially, he thought of the cries for help as a prank, but soon realized they were not made in vain. Seeing the blood on his mother's wounds confirmed the seriousness of the situation to him. As soon as the bear came into view, Blake tapped into his nature buff library of bear battling tactics. He told the other family members to get loud and get big. Whether he knew this was a predatory attack or not was not indicated in any source I could find, but his advice was solid gold. In an act of unison, they each began to yell and jump around like a pack of enraged cavemen. They threw sticks up into the air and raised their hands above their heads in a show of force. Upon seeing this group of humans standing their ground and clearly choosing to fight, or at least acting like they were, the sow stopped and examined the group for a few seconds. She seemed unsure if it was worth it, as that accounting of calories she'd been tabulating since the beginning of this attack was no longer in her favor. The noise and demonstration put on by the family convinced her to seek easy food in another place. She turned slowly and ambled off into the brush on the side of the trail. As soon as the sow had left the trail and disappeared from view, the 4 hikers turned tail and booked it the entire 4 miles remaining on their return to the trailhead. The children marveled at Lori's ability to complete the journey despite her wounds, but when you have a warrior for a mom, it's kind of expected. The shock of the event would have left me a mumbling mess. Lori was taken to the hospital where her wounds were cleaned before being closed with 14 stitches in her back and 14 more in her leg. On top of that, she received rabies and tetanus shots just to make sure she didn't contract either disease from her wounds, all while being treated at Lewis Gale Hospital, Allegheny. The Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries and Department of Conservation and Recreation law enforcement officers tracked the black bear aided by a wildlife biologist. They set out traps and baits to lure the bear out of hiding. The bear was found near the attack site and humanely dispatched at 4 p.m. Sunday, August 9th, 2015. As Lori convalesced in the hospital, her friends regaled her with deliveries of bear claw donuts and beer. Lori indicates that she doesn't blame the bear, despite its predatory actions toward her and her family. She also says that this event would keep her out of the woods, and that she doesn't plan on going back into bear country anymore. Lori finalized her sentiments with a statement regarding how the bear attack was surreal. The brave mother is glad the bear attacked her instead of her children. Virginia wildlife officials comment that there are 17,000 black bears in the state, and that attacks are very rare. They report that bear and human interactions are very few on record and consist primarily of the bear disappearing in a cloud of dust at the sight of a person. As for the bear, it turns out she was the mother of 2 9-month-old cubs who were orphaned due to the outcome of this attack. They would stand little to no chance of survival without their mother, and there is no record of agency trying or succeeding in capturing her cubs. They left no comment as to the overall health or age of the sow. After reviewing the details of this attack, I'm left with a few questions for you. Do you think the governmental agencies were justified in euthanizing this black bear sow? Would the black bear have tried to tangle with another human after being kicked and punched by such a protective mama? Was this family's behavior the only way to stop a predatory black bear attack? I'll be glad to read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the Elephant Back Loop Trail in Yellowstone National Park. The park is seated on the side of the world's largest batholith volcano, which provides the energy for the geysers and geothermal phenomenon here. This area is around 8,000 feet high in elevation and is thickly timbered rolling hills overlooking Yellowstone Lake. The forests, primarily of lodgepole pine, are 150 to 300 years old and are described by the Yellowstone Board of Review report regarding this episode as gray and brown in color. Given the age of the forest and the amount of duff accumulated on the forest floor, many forms of edible fungi grow on the ground and deadfall trees. These fungi provide a valuable source of nutrients to animals in the area and perform a vital function in the ecosystem. Animals like elk, deer, and moose will often dine on mushrooms whenever they can find them. Of the predators in the area, only bobcats and cougars are not known to consume mushrooms, but wolves, coyotes, as well as black bears and grizzly bears frequently seek them out as fare. Elephant Back Trail climbs 800 feet over its duration, which is only 1.5 miles long. About 0.8 of a mile up the trail is a fork. The left route leads directly to the overlook, which grants visitors a stunning view of the lake. The right route winds a bit more, but ends at the same overlook. As far as trails go, it isn't much of a trail, as it only takes visitors an hour or so to complete the loop. But if danger were measured by distance, it may be one of the most dangerous trails in the world. On Thursday, August 6, 2015, 63-year-old Lance Crosby was performing his duties at Lake Medical Clinic, where he had worked for the past 5 years. He was a native of Billings, Montana, and an avid hiker and outdoorsman. Just before lunchtime, Lance's coworkers reported seeing him at the medical center. He had recently injured his ankle and was in the habit of going out for walks near the center to help it heal and rehabilitate it. Lance enjoyed taking shortcuts through trail circuits just to wander through the stands of trees. On this day, he took no firearm nor bear spray with him. His co-workers watched Lance walk off along the road toward Elephant Back Trail and returned to their duties. On August 7th, Lance was expected at the center for work, but didn't show up at the start of his 8 a.m. shift. The staff thought this was peculiar, as he wasn't the kind of person to be late, and definitely would have called in had he come down with an illness. By 9 a.m., the staff at the medical center called in and reported Lance missing. Park rangers immediately formed a search team, and foot search teams began searching on Yellowstone Lake Beach, Natural Bridge Road, and Elephant Back Trail. During the search on Elephant Back Trail, a ranger discovered a carnivore food cache with a boot protruding ominously from beneath it. The ranger immediately backed out of the area, and all hikers were ordered to leave to preserve safety and evidence. An investigative team comprised of law enforcement officers, biologists, and medical professionals was formed. After the report of the carnivore food cache had reached the team, they prepared for a body recovery. About a half-mile northeast of the trail, rangers heard a cub bark 3 or 4 times as they approached. They observed a sow with dark brown legs and a light brown rump running away from the cache site. Once at the site, the investigative team began gathering evidence. They could see grizzly tracks from one sow and at least one cub near Lance's body. The bears had partially eaten his remains and then covered him in dirt and pine needles, indicating they were planning on returning to eat the rest of him after digesting the portions they had already consumed. Lance's remains were removed by helicopter and analyzed by forensic experts. They found deep bruising and puncture wounds on his arms, hands, head, face, shoulders, and upper back, indicating that he was alive when these wounds were inflicted. He had attempted to defend himself during the bear attack, based on the location of the wounds on his arms and hands. The puncture wounds on Lance's corpse were measured for comparison with the teeth of any bear thought to have been involved. After further analysis, Lance was found to have died from blunt force trauma to the area near his brainstem. He had been struck by the sow's paws with enough force that the blows had caused his death. At the attack scene, forensic experts collected bear hair samples and bodily fluids from the bears. They discovered that the grizzly had killed Crosby in an ambush and left him with very little time to react. He was face down with his left arm beneath his chest and his left leg crossed over his right calf. I have posted pictures of the attack site sketched by the forensics teams, as well as the picture of the dead bear on my Patreon link below. These images would not pass YouTube guidelines, so you can see them there. They are disturbing, at least as disturbing as a sketch of a bear attack scene and a photo of a dead bear can be, so look at them at your own discretion. Lance's baseball cap was found near his left boot, and his body was buried right where the attack had occurred, meaning the grizzly had not dragged him away at all. The investigators also reported that she had not run upon him, but the attack happened from extremely close range. The soil around the attack site wasn't disturbed. There were no tissue or clothing fragments strewn about, and his possessions were found near his body. He didn't even have time to run. The biologists on the scene searched for natural feeding behaviors and evidence. Bear daybeds and scat were located right next to rock cairns and other human-created rock formations left by prior visitors. DNA evidence was pulled from scat piles, and profiles from a sow and a cub were identified. They determined that the bears were likely foraging for mushrooms, and Lance had walked right up to them just before the attack. They were likely devouring mushrooms or napping just afterward when the surprise confrontation occurred. Equipped with this knowledge, biologists set out foot snare traps at the attack scene, hoping to catch the sow when she returned to her food cache. The night following the attack, she triggered the snare, and it held her fast until bear researchers could tranquilize her. Upon confirming through DNA evidence and bite wound measurements that they had the right bear, officials ordered the sow to be euthanized. As for her cubs, they were also trapped in the following days. They were not killed, but authorities deemed them to possibly be conditioned to see people as food. They were sent to a zoo to live out the remainder of their lives. After euthanizing the sow, investigators determined that she was only 259 pounds, which is thin for a grizzly bear. She had invested much of her food in the one-year-old cubs she had been raising. Regarding euthanizing grizzlies, park officials stated that they do not take the matter lightly. Had the sow been determined to have acted in defense of her cubs, she would likely have been left alone, if not relocated to areas further from civilization. Given that she had consumed portions of Lance's body and cached his remains for later consumption, they had no choice in the matter. Lance Crosby's death was the 8th human fatality in Yellowstone since 1916, but the 5th since 1984. 44 people have reportedly been injured by bears in Yellowstone National Park over its 150-year history. Grizzly numbers are estimated to be over 1,000 bears in the greater Yellowstone area, with the park only claiming 150 to 200 grizzlies within its boundaries. That means the difference of up to 800 grizzly bears are spread all around Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. If Lance had been packing bear spray, would he even have had time to dispense it? Was the sow defending her mushroom feeding grounds, or did she predate on Lance? Do you think the cubs would have copied the behavior they saw the sow do and consider humans as a source of food in their future? That's an ominous thought. Grizzly bears in the zoo watching something they think of as food walk by and stare at them and throw peanuts at them all day. Will you cast an extra cautious glance over your shoulder next time you're out picking mushrooms? I'll be glad to read and respond to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the Kenai Peninsula in southern Alaska. This huge jut of land pokes into the Gulf of Alaska and extends toward Kodiak Island. It has some high mountains in the southeast of the peninsula, but near Soldotna is a low-elevation plain that gently rolls into the Cook Inlet. The towns here push into the forest, which consists of birch, hemlock, and spruce trees. Common animals here include moose, porcupines, and hares. The predators on the peninsula are much more diverse, with weasels, foxes, lynx, and coyotes, rounding out the smaller meat-eaters. The larger ones are much more dangerous and include wolves, black bears, and brown bears. The Kenai River originates at Kenai Lake, which is fed by the Russian River. It flows for about 50 miles as the crow flies and empties into the Cook Inlet near the town of Kenai. The salmon that migrate upstream begin their lives as fry, which grow in Kenai and Skylac lakes before making their way to the sea for a few years. Upon their return, the salmon continue a flow of nutrients from the land to the sea and back again that sustains brown bears, as well as many other plants and animals in the ecology. This cycle on the Kenai Peninsula has supported over 600 brown bears, but these bears are genetically isolated and are trending downward in numbers, according to recent assessments. They have a unique gene pool among brown bears, which would be a pity to see go extinct. Just a little east of Soldotna is a town called Funny River. It is a dot of a town, which doesn't seem like a town at all, but more of an incorporated area. Around mile marker 11 of the Funny River Road that runs through town, a 62-year-old man named Danny High had his home on an acreage. One of his favorite things to do was to take the dogs for a walk and enjoy the fresh air and beautiful scenery the Kenai River offers. Now, Danny's acreage was at an interesting location on Funny River Road. To the south is land owned by varying federal, state, and tribal agencies, which is left in its natural state. Here, brown bears can travel freely and fight and mate and do all the normal bear stuff. To the west and the east of Danny's property, housing developments and busy roads crowd the bears' access to the Kenai River and the salmon that they pull from it. But right near Danny's property, development thins, and access to the river is much easier for the bears. To find similar access to the river, the bears would have to go 6 miles to the east, just to avoid human development. This bottleneck in travel corridors creates a funnel for hungry bears and leads them on a path right to Danny's and his neighbors' doorsteps. On September 13, 2015, around 4:30 p.m., Danny was out walking the dogs along one of the many four-wheeler roads that crisscross the area. The trails make the perfect escape into the trees that surround the residential developments. Brown bears are a frequent sight on these trails, but locals are so used to being near them that their presence isn't even alarming. On his hike, Danny didn't bring a firearm, nor did he bring along bear spray. Danny was such a good neighbor, he would frequently take his neighbor's dog for a walk. The dog's name was Layla, and her owner was named Diane Deming. After Danny picked up Layla from Diane's house, the two of them disappeared into the labyrinth of quad trails for a quick escape. Diane knew they wouldn't be long, and expected them to return in about 30 minutes or so. Danny enjoyed one of the benefits of pet ownership without the responsibility of taking care of one. He often took Layla out for walks, and she seemed to enjoy them too. After he spent some time relaxing in the woods, the two of them would go back and resume their lives as usual. But today would turn out to be very different from most days. As Danny and Layla made their way into the nearby trees, another denizen was also using the quad trails. A huge brown bear was likely making his way along the Kenai River in search of salmon carcasses or berries to pack on weight for hibernation. It was mid-fall now, and if the bear didn't have enough calories, it might not make it through the winter, so every calorie mattered. At this point of the fall, bears are in a state called hyperphagia, which is a hormonal state of intense hunger and desire for food. They are known to cover much broader swaths of territory in search of food sources, and will sometimes seek food from sources they wouldn't consider in prior seasons of the year. If the berry season was poor, or the salmon run was meager, then bears would have no option but to push in closer to town in search of food. As Danny and Layla walked down the quad trail, at some point they crossed paths with this massive brown bear. The details of just how this run-in occurred have not been relayed or made public. The results of the incident left Danny with grievous injuries and sent Layla dashing back to Diane. At 4:36 p.m., Diane heard Layla scratching at the back door. Before she could let Layla in, she heard her scratching at the front door. Diane hurried back toward the front door and let Layla inside, but Danny wasn't with her. Diane thought that perhaps he'd let her run ahead of him, so she glanced down the road, but couldn't see Danny. After a few minutes, her questions were answered, as emergency vehicles began to blare their sirens and converge on a nearby location. There was no way Diane could know, but a brown bear had attacked Danny while he and Layla were out for a walk. After Danny was severely injured, he somehow managed to pull out his cell phone and call 911. The sirens Diane heard were responding to his own request for help. First responders were sent out to the attack location at 4:45 p.m., and the first unit arrived by 4:58 p.m. Although their description of Danny's injuries was not detailed, they were described as very serious. It took the paramedics only 5 minutes to request a medical helicopter to Danny's location. It ferried him to a hospital in Anchorage, where he was held in critical condition. Danny went through his first surgery there on Monday. With injuries beyond their scope of care, the hospital in Anchorage arranged for an emergency medical flight, which took Danny to Harborview Medical Center in Seattle, Washington. After arriving at Harborview, additional surgical procedures would be completed to close and repair tissue damage the bear had done to Danny. Wildlife officers quickly converged on the attack site and searched for the bear responsible for Danny's mauling. Even though the search was thorough, it was fruitless in finding a bear in the area. Authorities decided to adopt a strategy of waiting out the bear to see if it would return and pose further risks to residents of the area. After the bear didn't return, they concluded that the attack was likely defensive and the bear didn't have predatory motives in attacking Danny. According to Danny's wife, his recovery was slow but steady. Given his proximity to town and access to immediate medical attention, his life was saved. Events could have ended up very differently for him if he were only a few miles away from the resources needed to save his life. From the time Danny left Diane's house with Layla to the point he called 911, only 6 minutes had elapsed. He was located a quarter mile from his home, which means most of that 6 minutes was spent walking with Layla and not being attacked by the bear. In only a few seconds, this bear did enough damage to Danny's body to threaten his life, in a location that would make the thought of this scenario unlikely. Due to the rapid response and availability of medical attention, he survived. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. Do you think bear spray would have prevented this attack? I kinda doubt it. Do you think Layla's presence may have been a contributing factor in the attack? Is the development around Kenai River an example of poor planning? The next time you take your dog out for a walk in the woods, will you be packing bear spray or a firearm? I'll gladly read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the Norwegian Arctic island of Svalbard. It's about 800 miles from the North Pole and 500 miles north of mainland Norway. Many areas in the Arctic are surrounded by cold ocean currents, which make them too cold to support plant life. Svalbard is surrounded by relatively warm ocean currents, which raise temperatures enough to allow for some plants to grow there. These currents bring warmer air to support the 2,026 species of mosses, lichens, fungi, and plants. The farther north and south you go toward the poles, the fewer species are present in ecosystems, and the more specialized they have to be. Caribou are an example of a specialized species and are the only large mammals on the island that are not predators. The predators on the island include Arctic fox and the polar bear. Svalbard was the center of a total solar eclipse on March 21, 2015. This stunning natural phenomenon occurs when the moon passes directly between the sun and the earth, disturbing light and shadow patterns. I experienced being close to the center of a solar eclipse in August 2017 in western Idaho. It was one of the most intriguing moments of my life, and I have photos to prove it. The announcement of the solar eclipse in Svalbard created a rush for reservations at area hotels and housing rentals. The region only has about 2,500 people, and many of them rented a room of their home out to one of the 2,000 eclipse fanatics for extra income. Svalbard is a beacon for ringed seals, walruses, and beluga whales, which are all primary prey for polar bears. Where you find prey, you'll find predators, and polar bears are plentiful here as well. Locals know that they need to pack firearms at any time when they venture away from civilization, but some visitors aren't so savvy to the rules. The authorities in the area require anyone leaving inhabited areas to carry a hunting rifle or be accompanied by a local armed guard. The danger polar bears present to unaware visitors is taken so seriously here that Ronnie Brunvall, the head of the Visit Svalbard organization, states that security is number 1, 2, and 3. On the evening of March 20th, 2015, 37-year-old Jakob Marvik was resting inside of his tent for the evening. He'd traveled to Svalbard with 5 of his friends, and they'd pitched camp along a snowbank for the night. With temperatures hovering below zero and light fading by early afternoon, the campers found comfort within their tents. Each tent in the expedition had a high-powered rifle leaning outside of it for easy defense against polar bears. The group also erected a security fence around their campsite, which would alert them to any approaching bears, and then they snuggled into their warm sleeping bags. The expedition also established a bear watch, and Mrs. Hakova was on duty this evening. She'd set up outside initially and eventually got weary, moving her bear watch inside to the comfort of her tent. She knew she could rely on the bear fence to alert her of anything serious, so she reclined with confidence. Jakob was an avid outdoorsman and loved to ski, snowboard, and snowmobile. He and his friends were from Prague, Czechoslovakia, and had made their arduous trip to the town of Longyearbyen with excitement. The expedition he was with had purchased a group package that permitted them to do these activities in the lead-up to and after the solar eclipse. It was supposed to be like a vacation for them, albeit a cold one. Unbeknownst to the expedition, the fence they'd erected had been placed too high. A hungry polar bear had been wandering the area, following its nose to its next meal when it stalked upon the camp in the night. It easily slipped right under the fence without tripping the alarm, exposing the sleeping campers to whatever the bear chose to do to them. As the polar bear noiselessly padded through the camp, the scent of sleeping people undoubtedly filled its nostrils. An overload of olfactory information was bombarding the bear's nose as it sniffed each tent in turn. For some unknown reason, the polar bear found Jakob's tent most appealing. The fabric of the tent was designed to resist the rigors of wind and snow, but not the claws and teeth of polar bears. Its claws ripped through the tent with very little resistance, and it was quickly inside, atop Jakob. Jostled awake by the polar bear's claws, Jakob opened his eyes to see the gaping maw of a polar bear less than 3 inches from his face. He yelled, "Bear! Bear!" as he scrambled to keep the bear's jaws from clamping down on his face. Using his hands, he repeatedly redirected the bear's jaws from his head. The bear used its paws to grab the man and drag him from the tent. Its claws tore long red streaks along his skin. In the tent next to Jakob's, Mrs. Hakova had let her eyes close and drifted off to sleep during her bear watch. Her slumber was abruptly halted by Jakob's cries about the bear. She scrambled from her tent, clutching the revolver that she had packed with her. Upon emerging, she could see a huge polar bear striking Jakob with his paws, only feet from her. She raised her pistol and fired the revolver at near point-blank range, striking the polar bear with more than 2 of the rounds. The camp seemed to erupt in people yelling and screaming while they converged on the bear. It had felt the impact of the revolver rounds and turned in pain and confusion. The bear dashed off to avoid any further confrontation with the people and stared back at them from only a few hundred yards outside of camp. The campers reached out to local authorities, who soon arrived by helicopter to investigate the polar bear attack on Jakob. They were armed and began following the bear's blood trail across the snow. The bear was located and shot by them only 200 meters from the camp. They took the bear's carcass back to the lab to analyze it. They were interested in knowing the causes of the predatory attack. I found no source indicating the findings of this analysis. Even though no other campers were injured during this attack, the organizer of the expedition was fined $1,200 by local authorities. It was the first time the fine was evoked for a polar bear attack. It was issued because the organizers neglected to perform basic safety precautions to protect campers and bears. Following his attack, Jakob expressed eagerness to return to Svalbard and the beauty of the Arctic. His enjoyment of the area was not diminished due to the polar bear's predatory attack. However, he did express disappointment that the bear attack forced him to seek medical attention. Consequently, he missed the eclipse. Approximately 3,000 polar bears are living around Svalbard, and only 2,500 human inhabitants. Yearly, an average of 3 polar bears are killed by residents defending their life or property. There have been a total of 5 fatal polar bear attacks on Svalbard in the last 40 years. In an episode on our channel, Horatio Chappell's fatal polar bear attack was discussed, and I've linked to it in the comments section below if you're interested in watching it. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. Why do you think the campers didn't test the bear fence before they went to bed? Do you think bear spray would have prevented this attack? Would you have the discipline to shoot a polar bear in such proximity like Miss Hakova? If I'm ever put in that position, I sure hope I'm that brave. I'll be glad to read and respond to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it.
Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider clicking on the like button and clicking on the bell icon. We'll help you know when we post our new episodes. Posting our video links to your social media profiles furthers awareness, and it's fun. We slashed our prices in our merch store, linked below, so check out the bargains there while you shop. As a member of our human community, remember to adventure bravely and be careful out there, especially in bear country.